me to present the oldest game that I've ever featured on this show thus far, and quite possibly the oldest I'm ever likely to feature for quite some time. You'll notice I don't even have my Piper ashtray out on the table this time around, as this is quite the fragile piece. My wife and I have already had to get the scotch tape after a couple of play money bills, so I don't want to take any chances. This is Big Business, a game made by a company called Transagram in 1936, and I think it might be one of the earliest, if not the earliest, Monopoly clone, with the former first hitting shelves just a year after the latter. Which may at least partially explain why I was never able to get more than one person at a time to play this with me. I went through all the trouble of making a version of this on Tabletop Simulator too. Oh well, let's see if the game deserves the negative reputation which at least seemed to precede it, shall we? And as a side note, while I will still be showing the physical game in the review, again, I'm a little afraid to touch it any more than necessary. So whenever possible, I'll be showing aspects of gameplay using the version that I made in Tabletop Sim, which, for review purposes, I tried to make as accurate to the real thing as possible. You're kidding, right? Yeah, there's not really all that much to talk about with the box this time around. It's just a plain old cardboard box with a sticker slapped on top. But hey, at least the sticker gives you some idea as to what you're in for. How smart are you at business? Here's $150,000. Prove it! It also describes itself as the new edition, although I'm not sure how, considering the copyright year, 1936, is again the year the game first came out. And speaking of firsts, the makers of the game, Transagram, who had been in business about 20 years at this point, had made a number of toys and playsets already, but Big Business would seem to be one of their first actual board games, which might go some way toward explaining the bare-bones box art. Later editions of the game would feature more elaborate designs for the cover, and even the first edition of Monopoly, while also fairly basic in its design, was still fancier than what we got here. As we move on to the components of the game, one of the first things you notice is that, in stark contrast to the box that holds it, the actual board is quite the display of color, with a light blue map of the US under a Big Business logo printed in appropriately big letters, all surrounded by a multicolored playing area with the aforementioned states, as well as the District of Columbia, comprising the game's 49 spaces. It was actually surprising to me just how colorful the board was, and I couldn't put my finger on why, until a friend of mine that I actually did manage to convince to play the game with me brought up a good point. When the average person thinks of the 1930s, chances are the first thing that comes to mind is the films and the photographs of the era, almost all of which were, of course, in black and white. And when you're used to associating a particular time period with a monochrome color scheme, eventually you just sort of subconsciously accept that everything's black and white. And it can be easy to forget that things have an actual color to them, which we can't see on this side of the lens. All of the properties in the game are states, though not all states are properties. Some will send you forward or backward on the board, or tell you to lose a turn or take an extra one, while still others have other functions we'll talk about in more detail later. In all, 25 of the 48 state spaces are actual properties, and each is represented by small cards referred to as patents. They're simple enough in their design, bearing the name of the state, as well as a particular industry, which presumably that state excelled in at the time, though I couldn't say for certain, as well as a price for that state based on its then current population, calculated at $1,000 per million people. Each patent card also bears an illustration of the relevant industry, done in a simplistic outline style and fairly decently drawn, while oh dear. Yeah, I was kind of debating whether or not I wanted to address this in the video, and while originally I wasn't going to, I figured it'd be better to chip in my 2 cents than to be accused of blatantly ignoring it. Obviously, some of these drawings are awkward at best. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It certainly wouldn't fly today if the game were remade. But if ever there were a time when the phrase "sign of the times" was accurate, it'd be now. A board game this may be, but it's also a piece of history, and like it or not, it's a window into the way things were back then. Moving on from the awkwardly drawn patent cards, next in the list of contents are these 4 charts, which are assigned to each of the first 4 players. One of the charts lists the rent to be paid on each state, while the other 3 serve as the chance community chest equivalents. The rest of the pieces aren't really all that impressive, even considering the time period. The 6 player tokens are simple blocks of wood, each one painted a different color, with the exception of player 6's token, which is unpainted for whatever reason, and emblazoned with the appropriate number in black. Even simpler than the player tokens are big businesses equivalent to houses and hotels, referred to respectively as development units and full developments. They're just tiny little discs of wood, with only the full developments getting a color treatment. The play money is, well, your typical play money fare. Again, nothing here to write home about. Setup begins with the standard roll to determine playing order, but with a bit extra tacked on. The 4 highest rollers are referred to as cabinet members and receive one of the 4 charts based on their position. The highest roller gets the number 1 player token, as well as the Secretary of the Treasury chart, which details the rent paid for each applicable state. Not that it really makes any difference one way or the other, but the instructions also suggest that the Secretary of the Treasury should sit with the big business logo facing him and the District of Columbia in the top left corner, so that he can have the extra play money positioned close by, since the Secretary of the Treasury, as the name might imply, also acts as the banker. The next highest roller is given the Secretary of State's chart. This comes into play anytime another player lands on a space labeled State Fair. Per the instructions, the Secretary of State should be seated to the immediate left of the Secretary of Treasury. Player 3, who again sits to the left of Player 2, gets the Attorney General's chart, which affects players landing on Supreme Court spaces. And to Player 3's left is the last of the 4 cabinet members in charge of the Postmaster General's chart, whose associated space is called Letters from Home. Despite there being only 2 more player tokens, the instructions make allowances for up to 8 players to take part by using coins or buttons as the extra tokens. Even a 9th person can join in by handling the money. Because, sure, an 8-player game of not Monopoly absolutely isn't a disaster waiting to happen. With the players in their assigned positions, the money is handed out. The varying covers for later editions of the game suggest that the opening state changes from version to version, but our copy promises $150,000, so $150,000 it is. Each player gets the $150K thusly: 1 $50,000 bill, 6 $10,000 bills, 3 $5,000 bills, 6 $2,000 bills, 9 $1,000 bills, 7 $500 bills, and finally, 5 $100 bills. Once each player has gotten their opening stake, the Secretary of Treasury sets aside another $150,000 in the same denominations for use as government funds, after which, interestingly, the rest of the money is put out of play. So a nice simple setup. As for the actual gameplay, well, again, if you've played Monopoly, you've pretty much played big business, so I won't be going into too much detail about the rules, but there are a few tweaks and differences to the format. On his turn, a player rolls the dice and moves the appropriate number of spaces. If he lands on an unowned state, he can purchase the patent for the state right for the price listed on that state. But it's not as simple as just buying the state and moving on with your life. Here in this game, when you buy a state, you also have to buy at least 1 development unit along with it, and each development unit costs the same as the state you're developing. So a development unit for Louisiana would cost $2,000, while one for New York would cost $13,000. So when you're buying a state, you're actually paying at least double the listed price. If I had to hazard a guess as to a reason for the extra cost, I'd say, I don't know, maybe it's to get you more invested in your properties, so you don't have them just laying around all game and you don't do anything with them, but I don't know, even that just seems like a bit of a flimsy justification, and it just seems like such an unnecessary requirement. With the state purchased and the development unit or units placed on the stars on the back of the space, the player's turn continues if he has any more development units he wants to place on any of his states, or if he wants to trade states with another player, which can only be done at the start of a turn, otherwise the turn moves on to the next player. If a player lands on a state owned by someone else, then he pays rent to the owner based on how developed that state is, as you might expect. But there's another factor which affects rent as well: the industries. They're not just listed on the state for flavor text. While a few industries like aviation or dairy are only associated with one particular state, many industries are associated with 2 or even 3 states. So if a player lands on Tennessee, which is a lumber state, and the player that owns it also owns Washington, the other lumber state, then the rent paid is doubled. Likewise with industries tied to 3 states, only there the rent is tripled. As you might have gathered by looking at the corners of the board, there is no jail or free parking space to worry about. There isn't even a special rule for rolling doubles. That's just another normal roll in this game. But there is a mechanic for passing go, or in this case, the District of Columbia. And it's here where things get just a little bit confusing. When a player passes DC, they collect a salary of $15,000 from the government. But before that happens, they must first pay the Secretary of the Treasury $500. Now to clarify, I don't mean that you pay the government or bank like you would when purchasing states. No, I mean you pay the Secretary of the Treasury, aka Player 1, $500. Now the instructions make no mention of whether the Secretary of the Treasury then hands that $500 over to the government or if he just keeps it himself. In the few instances I was able to get somebody to play this with me on TTS, we agreed that the Secretary of the Treasury should keep the $500 as a sort of a perk for being the highest roller, but it definitely could have stood to be made clearer. Now that's just for passing DC. If a player should land on the District of Columbia, then the government forks over $30,000. After you first pay the Secretary of the Treasury $1,000. Now it should be noted that if you're sent back to the District of Columbia as a result of a space you land on, the salary mechanic doesn't apply. Speaking of perks for the cabinet members, the District of Columbia isn't the only place to earn money. Each cabinet member has a home state listed at the top of their chart. If they land on their home state, they get $15,000, this time without having to pay anybody anything. And again, it would seem it pays to be first in this situation, as the home state for the Secretary of the Treasury is the District of Columbia, meaning if Player 1 lands on DC, not only does he not have to pay anyone $1,000 for the privilege of getting 30, he also gets another 15 on top of that, for a grand total of $45,000. Also, you'll remember in the setup I mentioned that the unused play money is put out of the game. Well, that actually has an effect on the proceedings, as should the government run out of funds at any time, then nobody collects their salary and play continues as normal. Although presumably the Secretary of the Treasury still gets his cut for players landing and passing DC. Again, the manual doesn't make that clear. About the only other major difference to go over here is the Supreme Court, State Fair, and letters from home spaces. When a player lands on one of these, he rolls the dice again. The appropriate cabinet member then reads the instruction for that roll, and the player that landed on that space will either pay money to or gain money from that cabinet member. Again, no money changes hands with the government here. This is just a side game between two players. This is the reason I was trying to get a game going with more than just two people. The three cabinet spaces can introduce a nice bit of variety to the gameplay, but with the charts tied to actual players, in a two-player game, that's half the charts gone, and with one of the remaining charts being just a simple listing of rent, suddenly you're looking at a lot of spaces on the board on which nothing happens, and things start to get boring quickly. You know, I kinda have to wonder if Transagram actually knew that when they included a rule in the manual that allowed a player to simply retire from the game at any point. There are two ways to end a game of big business. Tempting, but no. If at any time a player owes the government or another player money that he doesn't have, he can sell off any or all of his assets for 50% of their value. But if, after selling off all of his assets, he still can't pay off what he owes, that player is bankrupt and out of the game. A standard game ends as you might expect with a Monopoly clone, with the last player standing after everyone else bankrupts being declared the winner. However, the instructions offer a shorter variant, wherein the game ends after just one person goes bust, after which the remaining players count up their money and the richest player wins. All in all, Big Business is a decent enough game. A bit involved, sure, and with a bit of ambiguity in the rules, but enjoyable under the right circumstances. It had a good run on store shelves. Sources vary as to the exact dates, but it seemed to eventually disappear around the early to mid-60s. I seem to recall paying about $10 for my copy at the local antique store, and you could probably find it for that price, maybe even less, on eBay fairly easily, although I have seen it flirt with the $30 range as well. Could it work if it were brought back today? I mean, I suppose from a technical standpoint it could, but really why would you want to? Nowadays, Monopoly pretty much has the monopoly on monopolies, with about 47 million different variations of the game, including the base version, so what'd be the point? I'd say, unless you're specifically collecting items from the era or you just really want a different take on Monopoly, leave it and just go for the genuine article. And so ends another glimpse into Board Game Obscura. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to doing it again next time. Hope you'll join me. Jikai mare. Sayonara.